Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We have a range of news items for you, everything from different ways to run a vaccine clinic, through to new viruses that could be an emerging disease, creation of tiny but functional hearts, water that contains diseases despite being bottled and otherwise good for you, mouse plagues in Australia, and the lunar eclipse that has the world talking. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with vaccine clinics, specifically those being held in Las Vegas, the city of the damned in many ways, all the more so for those who happen to get their vaccine administered at a strip club. Yes, Las Vegas officials are getting to the point where they're using a strip club to distribute vaccines. This is all part of various government agencies and health departments' effort to incentivize individuals to take the vaccine, as there's a slowing demand, that is, fewer people are taking it up. And one way to make sure they can use it or take it up if they so wish is to make it as available as possible. These pop-up vaccination clinics are just one such way to do so. While a strip club might be novel, Nevada's officials have tried various other places. These include churches, schools, and senior centers. This was just one more place that was novel enough that it might get a few more people through. In other vaccine news, there's information about Moderna, and specifically Moderna's interest in having their vaccine available for teenagers. At the moment, there is some concern about vaccines and teens in general, particularly for those that have already been given temporary or emergency approval. Moderna's results show a variety of things, and they can all be seen here in this simple summary. This is the sort of thing that people aren't really familiar with when they start talking about vaccines. There are always going to be some side effects. Generally speaking, these are going to be limited. Things like maybe a slight fever, pain in the injection site. But once you start giving medication to a large enough cohort of individuals, there will be more unexpected side effects. That's why this sort of information that summarizes just how effective it is and the fact that it is well tolerated. This means that you might get some minor, otherwise insignificant side effects that simply cause inconvenience for a time. Despite all of this, even using the CDC's most broad definition of what could be an infection, it was still 93% effective at preventing any kind of CCP virus related incident. That's 93% efficacy, assuming every minor cough, fever, or discomfort that could have occurred was due to CCP virus. Consider the difficulty so far in getting people to be vaccinated, and the fact that the vaccines so far from all clinical trials have demonstrated absolute efficacy in nearly all cases, and those incidents that have come up are easily worked around once they've been discovered. The question is why people are so hesitant. One of the reasons appears to be chiropractors. We've previously discussed how one chiropractor was being penalized for making claims about the efficacy of their vitamin supplement. That is, that it could somehow prevent the CCP virus. It was a combination of zinc and vitamin D. Not exactly groundbreaking discoveries there. Well, it seems that they're not the only chiropractor who is naysaying vaccines in lieu of their own particular line of reasoning. They make various claims, and perhaps some of the most egregious is that either that they have extreme and otherwise undocumented side effects, or in other cases that they're untested and unproven. The clinical trials we've already mentioned for teens are just further testing for a new possible application that it hasn't been approved for yet. These sorts of clinical trials have already been run on a large scale for adults, and continued monitoring is occurring. That's why we know about some of the otherwise unexpected and unobserved side effects from the clinical trials. Problems with chiropractors are particularly pronounced in Georgia, where one of the largest educational institutes is located. That is Life University, and some of the most notorious anti-vaxxer chiropractors are alumni of that particular institute. While on the topic of anti-vaxxers, they're engaging in other, even more destructive activities. Rather than using their position of authority to encourage others not to take up the vaccine and thereby abusing that authority, some anti-vaxxers are going so far as to book appointments for a vaccine under false pseudonyms, thereby depriving those who in Canada want the vaccine from being able to get it. That is, they are effectively robbing others of the opportunity, wherein they have chosen of their own volition to be vaccinated and instead can't because these groups haven't taken up all the bookings that they can under fake names. Next, we have an interesting discussion about Australia, who is one of the countries that has largely got the CCP virus under control. You would think for a country largely originating from convicts, they would be less well behaved, but what do you know? The article looks at a range of opinions. Some of these are about national security and border control. Some are about vaccines. Then they have whether or not vaccinations should be mandatory. There are a range of opinions, and the article explores how they've changed over the last year, given exposure to the CCP virus. What is interesting is the way different opinions have changed on personal positions. That is, personal relationships, technological skills, and somewhat importantly, mental health. The last one has suffered the most in Australia, following the variety of lockdowns and different measures the governments have brought in at both a national and state level. There's an interesting correlation, at least according to this article, between political party affiliation and how bad your mental state has fallen during the last 12 months. In particular, the Greens, or the Environmental Party, appears to have had the most members severely affected by the various limitations put on their life, while the more conservative parties have less so. Going back now to anti-vaxxers, but more broadly now, rather than focusing on the CCP virus vaccines, instead we're going to look at teenagers, and particularly how teenagers are working together to get each other vaccinated when they have anti-vaxxer parents. This sort of thing is more important when you look at data coming out of America. 25% of parents would not let their child be vaccinated at present. 18% would only do so if it was mandated by schools. That is nearly half of the 27 million children in America who wouldn't be able to receive the vaccines, an important step in stopping the spread of the CCP virus. Lindenberger, who was famous for being on Reddit and asking how he could be vaccinated, and then testifying before Congress about the impact of social media on anti-vaxxers and therefore children, has been providing some advice, and the simplest of which is, try to talk it out with your parents, and if that doesn't work, then you need to weigh carefully the implications of being vaccinated and what effect it might have on your home life. Vaccines are important, and effectively so in that they can so very efficiently control outbreak of diseases. Every year we can seriously reduce the number of dead and dying from influenza simply by having the influenza vaccine available. With that in mind, it's the next possible influenza outbreak that is a concern. This is the H5N8, a variant of avian influenza. Avian influenza is one of the big problems. It circulates in the environment and eventually finds its way into domesticated poultry, ducks, chickens, and similar. Then it finds its way to humans. In the process of moving from animals to humans, it gets more pathogenic and can be very aggressive. The only way to control it so far has been to cull the birds that are infected and then burn them. Obviously, this leads to millions of birds worldwide being destroyed every year out of concern for the outbreak. At the moment, there are at least 46 countries that have the H5N8. Only late last year in Russia, the virus jumped from birds to workers, and this led to their infection. This particular form of avian influenza is an example of why careful monitoring of diseases found in nature, those natural reservoirs, is so very important. Exactly the same reason why we should be carefully monitoring things like the CCP virus. The coronaviruses found in bats easily move from one animal to another and can find their way through the food chain to humans in one way or another. While careful monitoring and research into tropical and novel diseases is important, other lines of research are as if not more important in some ways. For example, this beating heart that's the size of a small grain of rice. This was grown in a lab and grown from a small bundle of human stem cells and created an artificial heart. While not a heart exactly, it's very close. It is essentially a hollow chamber and that can compress itself. This is just like the chambers of the heart. Previous research has achieved something a little bit similar, but it always needed to have a scaffold. That is, some sort of structure that these cells could be grown onto. In this case, they didn't need that. Instead, they used signaling pathways that are known to be involved in the development of the human embryo's heart. Other possible research that's being looked into at the moment is a gene therapy to restore vision, or at least partially restore vision for those who are blind. The treatment in this case involved a neurodegenerative eye disease called retinitis pigmentosa. It's a rare disease and doesn't affect that many people. It's about 1 in 4,000. One of the people involved with this could more or less only detect whether or not there was light or no light before treatment. After treatment, they regained some sense of vision. Although it still wasn't perfect as they required extra support, they still could see far more than they could beforehand. From not being able to do anything more than differentiate between when there was and wasn't light, he was able to very broadly identify shapes and items. This ranges from everything from a drinking glass through to a book. Going back to chiropractors now, we'll touch on allegations about one particular incident. That is, a Calgary woman claims that she had a stroke after seeing a chiropractor. This was the start of this year, specifically the end of January. What happened was that one of her vertebral arteries was cut. These arteries are rather important as they are one of the 4 main arteries that supply blood to the brain. Without this blood supply, the brain begins to die. The association with the chiropractor is fairly straightforward. The chiropractor asked if the woman would like her neck adjusted. She agreed, and the moment it was done, she blacked out. She then woke up in a hospital. This should be a parable for everybody in not using a chiropractor. In other experiences people can learn from, bottled water, specifically the Real Water brand, has had to be recalled amid a number of people dying due to, liver illnesses caused by the water itself. The water is supposed to be healthy and detoxifying, a certain irony given what it's causing, and the federal authorities have ordered it to be recalled as a result. According to the federal authorities, at least one person has died and a number of people have developed liver diseases because they've consumed the water in these bottles. The water is sold as an alkalized drinking water, and as we've previously explained, alkali water does nothing more for you than regular water does, due to the nature of the stomach acid. The only slight caveat at this point is that the alkaline nature of the water might mitigate some of the immunological protections the stomach acid provides in preventing pathogens from getting into you. There is a point at which trying to go too far down the healthy pathway ceases to be healthy and instead becomes quite harmful. There's some expression about moderation and all things being good in moderation. Of course, some people will nearly always try and jump on any idea to rob others of their hard-earned money, and this is the case with cancer as well. We want to talk about a particular fraudster in this case, Belle Gibson. They made their fortune and a variety of other contracts such as books, TV appearances and so on by claiming to have cured themselves of cancer using diets and things that they then published. The problem here is that Belle Gibson never had cancer. All the evidence that they used to claim that they did have cancer was, well, made up. The whole saga involving Belle Gibson has come to an end quite some time back, with the Australian government and the state authorities there having seized what they can and put liens against their property to the best that they could. Despite this, there was still over $500,000 in outstanding penalties waiting to be paid. The news came back up this week after their property was raided in an effort to try and see whether or not they were still hiding valuables and why they had not yet made payment on the penalties that they had been issued. Cancer scammers are not the only issue that Australia has. At the moment, they're in the middle of a mouse plague. Millions and millions of mice are eating their way through parts of the eastern coast of Australia. They're consuming everything in sight, whether that's fields with grain, hay and straw for animals, and all sorts of other things. In fact, it's so bad that they're taking over houses, buildings, and in some cases even affecting institutes like hospitals. Given that over recent years Australia has dealt with fire, flood, drought, and now possibly famine, you'd expect that the country well known for everything trying to kill you would be better prepared. But the problem is, this is actually part of their normal life. Regular mouse plagues are simply a fact. While not an annual event, they are still extremely regular. Finally, news about the total lunar eclipse that you may have missed on Wednesday night. This was not just a total lunar eclipse though, it was a supermoon as well. This meant the moon looked much larger than usual and turned a dark red colour. You might almost think the gods were angry if you were superstitious seeing this. In fact, it's entirely a product of the way the sunlight hits the moon around the Earth. Only the red light can get through, and so the moon turns red in colour. This is much like what happened a few years back, and we have a video dedicated to explaining just what's happening and why. That's all the news we have for you. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.